Hi, welcome to our YouTube channel here at Mudline Church of the Nazarene and our brand new series called Back to Basics, where we'll be looking at the Ten Commandments, but hopefully in a little different way than we've ever heard them before. Not because there's something new, but by going back to the ancient world where these first instructions were given. There's something so basic, something so foundational about these things. We're not going to be looking at them as required rules, or if you don't do it, then God's going to get you. That's not part of this. But rather lift them out of their ancient context and see what they might have meant to the first people that heard them. And see then if there's anything we can carry forward into our world. Now, we're going to do it just a little different. One thing we're going to change up the order a little bit. We're going to use the order the ancient Jews used to recognize these Ten Commandments. So all that'll do is basically change the first and second commandment. But let's get going right away with the first commandment. And we find it in Exodus chapter 20. And it basically says this: Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of slavery. The first command, then, is that simple first phrase, I am the Lord your God. Now that's a little different. We'll hear the difference that makes when we get to next week for the second command. How would that be a command that I could apply to my life? This simple phrase, I am the Lord your God. Well, we have to remember the situation at the time. Israel, or the ancient Jews, had been in Egypt for 400 years. It started out good enough. Joseph was there. Things went well for Joseph. Eventually, he had a rocky start. His family joined him. Then the Jews began to grow, and others came and got to be fairly sizable. So sizable that it worried Egypt, and for some reason, and for somehow, and we're not exactly clear in exactly how this worked, but Egypt then used the Jews and controlled the Jews in a way for their own benefit. And so the Jews were in Egypt for 400 years, and life got to be very, very hard and very, very difficult. And that's where the biblical story picks up. After a very difficult, a very scary time called the plagues, which Jews also experienced, most of them, they were allowed to leave Egypt. And they fled. They saw Pharaoh chase them. They saw Pharaoh's army wiped out in the story. And they get to the point where they meet God at the mountain. And Moses goes up and gets these 10 commandments and comes back down. So this first command, I am the Lord your God, that's supposed to contrast to what they just left. They just left a time of chaos. They just left a life of servitude, a life of slavery. They've left the only thing they've ever known. Remember, they've been there 400 years, so everybody that left, that's the only life they've ever been familiar with. And so even though they've left, the question is, what is my new direction? What is my new identity? What direction are we going as a people? What direction am I going as an individual? They may have never known that their former life was slavery, unless they got a taste of real freedom. And in order to get that taste, they must follow a new way. They must follow a new God. I don't think our lives are that much different from theirs in this sense. All of us follow a God. The question is, which one? Seems we're hardwired to worship something. So it was a contrast. Your former way of life was this way. Now I am the Lord your God. So from this point, your God is me. So it was also a change of identity for these people. Nations at that time were known by their gods. Egypt worshipped a number of gods, but their main god was the sun god Ra. In depictions, in artwork, it was usually depicted as like a man with a bird's head, and the sun was behind them. And so Egypt worshipped the sun god. Now, connected with that sun god was their human god, Pharaoh. So Pharaoh was their immediate god. He was connected to Ra. As they moved up into Canaan, they became aware of a new god called Baal. Baal was the god of the storm. In December, January, February, the rains would come in that area of the world. If the rains did not come, well, the crops failed and people died. So they began to worship the god that controlled the seasonal rains, the storms coming off the Mediterranean. Baal had a god, a consort that went with him, and it was Asherah. You get in later the Old Testament, you see Israel erected Asherah poles, literally erected giant phallic symbols, and worshiped them and danced around them. When they're condemned by some of the prophets for following the ways of these false gods, that's the gods they were following, these fertility gods. And if you follow fertility gods, and if you dance around giant phallic symbols, well, we can guess what the worship consisted of. They would later come to know Molech. Molech was a god that required the sacrifice of a firstborn child. So nations at that time were known very much by their gods. They requested help from their gods to overcome the gods of the other nations around them. I think this is still true to some extent. We are known by our gods as a nation. I wonder what others think our God is if they peeked into our culture. I think maybe part of this is why there's some resistance to the West in some parts of the world, because they don't like what they see of our God. And I think this is also true personally. We are, to some extent, what we serve. We are what we follow. We represent the ideals that our God, our gods, require of us. So, in that context, this is where God steps in and says, I am the Lord your God. Not Pharaoh, not Molech, not Baal. I am the Lord your God. If Yahweh is God, then that means a host of other things just simply aren't. In that day, it meant Pharaoh wasn't. It meant Baal wasn't. It meant the little stone statue on their mantle wasn't. In our day, we don't have stone statues. But it does mean that a host of other things are not as well. If Yahweh is God in my life, that means money is not. It means position is not. It means power and notoriety aren't either. It means our lives then will reflect that. How many lives are degraded? How many homes are torn apart because we pursue these things? And what we pursue at the expense of everything else is our God. What is a highest ideal is our God. I wonder if someone examined our life for a month, what they would say our God is. How many kids are distanced from mom and dad because mom and dad are pursuing every last dollar, and every kid is pursuing every last grade and is pursuing just the right college, or somehow their lives will be ruined? How many spouses are distanced from each other because they're following gods that aren't gods? And this is 2020, so let me throw this in. In the shadow of last night's, in the shadow of these debates we're having with the Democrats, and it was the same as if we were having them on the Republican side as well. If Yahweh is God, that also means politics and party are not God either. It means that if the person we didn't vote for did not get elected, it means our lives aren't ruined. We read back in some books to come in the Old Testament, like the book of Daniel, where they are when they're in exile in Babylon or under pressure from a foreign army. And they were told this hopeful message: don't despair, because God is sovereign over even your local political situation. I would make that same reminder today. So the first command is very simply this: I am the Lord your God. And I'm the God who brings you out of slavery. I'm the God who brings order out of chaos. I'm the God who puts things right. That's the very first command we have. I'm the God who puts things right. I hope we remember that. And if we pursue that God, our lives will bear those marks as well. We welcome you to listen to future weeks. We also welcome you to comment. Please get in dialogue with us. Ask a question. Tell us we're full of it. Do whatever, and we will love to respond to you with a future video. But we'll see you back here in a future week.